Welcome to Lesson 2 of Unit 1, Political Parties. This is something that is interesting in Texas because it's a good story. It feels very Texas, the way that our political parties have come about. In Texas, we have a history of flip-flopping from one party to another as our dominant party. For years and years and years, Texas was all Democrat. Now, Texas is all Republican. The history's interesting, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first of all, what did the Founding Fathers think of political parties? They were not fans. They talked about the baneful effects of the spirit of the party and called parties factions that were divisive but inevitable. The Founding Fathers realized that parties would encourage conflict and undermine a consensus on public issues, but they were inevitable as people with similar views gravitated to different sides of an issue and formed parties. And we saw that even among the Founding Fathers, that they gravitated towards different sides of the aisle. If I have any Hamilton fans, you will remember that not everybody was on the same side. Not all the Founding Fathers were on the same side. And so the beginning of the country had political parties. What are parties really, though, and practically? They are just a broad-based coalition of people whose primary purpose is to win elections. It's just a group of people who believe mostly the same about a number of issues, and they work together to get someone elected that will carry out those views. The goal of the party is not to make everyone believe the same way that they believe, but it is to get people elected to gain control of the government through elections. So how does a party do that? They recruit and nominate people for office. They build majorities by forming coalitions or groups. If there are two groups who have similar thoughts about an issue but a few differences, the party will work together to try to bridge that gap between the groups and get them to cooperate so that it will increase the number of people in the party and increase the chances of getting a candidate elected. Parties are also a link between the people, the voters, and the government. They encourage voters to get involved in the election process as well as politics in general, and they encourage people to know the people that they are voting for and running for office. It helps people feel like they are a part of the government. Finally, a party allows ordinary citizens to participate in politics. So this is people who are not going to run for office and they don't necessarily want to be elected, but they want to participate in the process. Both Texas and the United States systems have two parties that are the dominant parties for all practical purposes. You'll see other parties on the ballot. Libertarian, Green Party are usually on there, but they are not strong enough to really be a political force. The system is also pragmatic or practical and decentralized. We're going to talk about those two things on the next slide. But let's talk about the third party. Why is it hard for a third party to win? Well, we saw in the first lesson that it's hard to even get on the ballot in the first place. You can't just show up when the ballots are being printed and ask to slide your name there at the bottom. You have to collect signatures, you have to pay money, you have to jump through hoops, get things notarized in order to even get on the ballot. Also hard for a third party to win because people don't want to waste their vote. They don't want to feel like they're throwing it away on someone who has absolutely no chance of winning. And then finally, it is hard for a third party to win because if a third party is successful enough that it has some momentum, then that party is going to get absorbed by either the Republicans or the Democrats. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party are such big machines that they will be able to absorb a smaller party who is having any kind of success. And I guess this is a good time to talk about the symbols. So the Republicans are usually noted with the elephant symbol, Democrats with the donkey. So Democrats, donkey, Republican, elephant. Also, people talk about something being a red state or a blue state. Red is associated with Republicans. Blue is associated with Democrats. So when you're watching TV on election night and you see a state get painted blue, it means that that state voted for the Democratic candidate, and vice versa. So what did I mean when I said that the parties today are pragmatic? So the parties are more concerned with practical results instead of the purity of principles. This means that while the ideology is fairly polarized with the liberals on the left and conservatives on the right, the actual parties are closer to the middle. There are very few voters who have such extreme views that the party moves closer to the middle in order to capture all of those voters who are a little bit more moderate. You'll notice that the parties will take popular positions on what are called valence issues or clear-cut issues that most people agree on. Example of this would be education. Everybody believes we need a strong educational system, so a party is going to take a position on strengthening the educational system by whatever means flows from that party's platform. Parties will stay away from being vocal on a position issue or an issue where the public is divided. An example of this is abortion. Usually the party will not lead every campaign speech talking about abortion because that's an issue where people have strong views and there's a clear-cut division between voters. The trend in parties is to move from decentralized power to more centralized structure. The parties are trying to have more direction from the top down, the national party giving direction and money to the local parties, instead of the other way around. It's going to be interesting to see if this trend continues after 2020 in the 2020 election, since it seems that sometimes the national party and the local parties don't see eye to eye on a whole lot of issues. So, something to watch out for. So how did we get to where we are in Texas? Today in Texas, it is a foregone conclusion that Texas is going to vote all of its delegates in a presidential election to the Republican Party. Democrats don't spend time or money campaigning in Texas, usually. They'll come once or twice, but they're not going to spend days and days in every state, kissing every baby, shaking every hand. That's not always been the case. Before 1845, so before the Civil War, before Texas became a state officially, people were either pro-Sam Houston or anti-Sam Houston. So Sam Houston was the president of the Republic of Texas, and he was not in favor of Texas seceding from the United States and joining the Confederacy. He thought that even though states should be able to have slavery, that nobody needed to fight the states who didn't have slavery. I want to take a second and be really clear that Sam Houston was not anti-slavery. He owned slaves, but he did not favor secession from the Union. He didn't want Texas to secede. Sorry. The anti-Houston group wanted to join the Confederacy and fight the Union states for the right to own slaves. So Texas decides to go with the Confederacy during the Civil War. They overthrow Sam Houston and put a new government in place. After the Civil War, there's Reconstruction, and during Reconstruction, the Democratic Party was the party in power. During this time, there was a rising threat from the Populist Party, or the People's Party, meaning that it was the party of every man. That was the kind of the thought behind the Populist Party. They were the farmer and the laborers, and they were trying to get as much participation in government as the wealthy landowners. As the Populist Party gained power nationwide, the Democrats, instead of fighting the Populists, just absorbed them. They realized the Populists were a force, and so Instead of trying to get everyone to leave the Populist Party, they just added the party to the Democratic Party. The Democrats kept power by doing things like enacting laws that would make sure people who would vote Republican traditionally were not going to threaten the election of Democrats. We talked about that in the last lecture. They used the white primary, the poll tax, in order to keep people who were associated with the Republican Party from voting. At this time, the Republican Party was former slaves, small farmers, sharecroppers, people who aligned themselves with Abraham Lincoln. During this time, the primary was key because whoever won the Democratic primary was the one who was assured the victory in the general election. The Democrats were able to keep power through the Great Depression, which was in the 1929 to 1933, because the Great Depression was blamed on the Republican Party. In fact, the Democratic Party was able to be the default controlling party in Texas until 1978. Don't forget that in the 1960s, it was Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a Democrat from Texas, who was the vice president, and then later the president. That might be foreign to us. It seems very strange because today we can't really imagine a Democrat being in statewide office or even being a vice president from our state. In 1978, Republicans started winning statewide offices, starting with Bill Clements, who was elected as a Republican for governor. Shortly after, more and more elections started being won by Republicans, and the last time a Democratic presidential candidate won in Texas was Jimmy Carter in 1976. Bill Clements did a lot of things that we're not very proud of, but the way he got elected was something to be proud of because he was able to reach across the aisle and show Democrats that he was just like them, and then show Republicans he was just like them. He had this rags to riches story about starting as a roughneck in the oil field, and so he could, relate to the everyday man, and then he worked his way up to be the owner of the company. So despite some things he said and did later in his career, he was really collaborative and helped the two parties work together in Texas and is credited with flipping Texas from Democratic to Republican. I wanted to take a little side note here because and talk about ideology versus party. This is something usually we would talk about at the beginning of the class, but again, since we're kind of flip-flopping the order a little bit, it's something we'll talk about in the next unit. Ideology is kind of like idea, and so it is something like conservative or liberal. The party is something that is like a group, an organization, Republican or Democrat. Sometimes these things line up where the Republicans are conservative and the Democrats are liberal, but they don't always line up the way you would think, especially in Texas. For many years, we had a lot of conservative Democrats in Texas. Sometimes you'll hear somebody say, I'm an economic conservative but a social liberal. So what does that mean when people say that? An economic conservative opposes government regulation of the economy and favors the free market to regulate itself. So we don't need big government telling us what to do with our money. The market is going to correct itself. An economic liberal is someone who thinks that government should be involved in the economy, and the government needs to make sure that there is a redistribution of wealth. The liberals will favor increasing taxes on the wealthy so that the tax dollars can be spent on public assistance programs for the poor. Socially, a social conservative is a person who aligns with traditional values and are skeptical of social change. They're slow to adopt a new way of thinking. For example, they would favor traditional marriage between a man and a woman, for example, and be skeptical of a change of the definition of marriage to include a woman marrying a woman or a man marrying a man. A socially liberal person will want the government to step in and protect civil liberties, but will favor pure individual rights. Basically, they don't want the government to regulate their morality. So I said that sometimes we have Democrats in Texas that are conservative. And for a long time we called these people Texas Democrats because they were conservatives who voted Democrat in state elections but Republican in presidential elections. This started during the Great Depression when there was some grumbling about New Deal propositions, and so they wanted to figure out a way to still consider themselves Democrats but vote for Republicans in nationwide elections. Conservative Texans had power in oil and gas and large corporations and large farms and ranches. They had money, they shared their money, and they also turned out to vote. Like I said before, 1976 was the last time a presidential candidate carried Texas, and that was Jimmy Carter. 1990 was the last time a Democrat was elected governor, and that was Ann Richards. And then in 1994 was the last time a Democrat was elected to a statewide office. There were some Democrats elected to a number of statewide offices, lieutenant governor and controller, but that was the last time. Since then, all the statewide elections have been won by Republicans. So, when you think of Texas as a Republican state, you have to remember that it has only been recently, like in the scope of history, that Texas has not been a Democratic state. We have seen de-alignment and realignment in Texas. You can see how Texas has flipped from Democrat to Republican when you compare what the offices looked like in 1973 versus what they look like in 2019. Realignment is the flipping of one party flipping from one party to another, so flipping from a Democrat state to a Republican state. De-alignment is when people who identify with one party consider themselves independents. And so I used to be a Democrat, but now I'm an independent. That is called de-alignment. And that, as you can imagine, really helps foster realignment, because as people are dropping out of the party, it allows a place for more people to join the opposing party. Realignment takes some time. It doesn't happen overnight. People's politics and political ideology is formed when they're young, and they tend to adopt their parents' ideology, remember, ideas, their parents' beliefs to some extent, and that will carry them through a portion of their young life. A shift in parties from one party to another is influenced by a shift in a national party. So if the national party starts acting differently, chooses different candidates, performs poorly in elections, there may be a shift from people identifying with that party that would start identifying with the opposing party. Also, a party's platform, which is a series of published positions on different issues, kind of the beliefs that the party holds. The platform, if it is not in line with what most of the people in the party believe, then it may cause people to shift to a new party. Also, newcomers can affect realignment. If there's a big influx of new people moving into the state, or new people coming to power in government, then that can cause people who were, traditionally in one party to switch to another party. So what we're going to do now is go through some different parts of the party platforms, and we are going to talk about where they, like whether it's a Republican or a Democrat who has published this in their platform. So, what party is it that believes a democratic government exists to help us achieve as a community, state, and nation what we cannot achieve as individuals, and that it must serve all people? That is from the Democratic platform. What party believes that economic success depends upon free market principles, that it is our duty to protect innocent life, develop responsible citizens, and it is founded on the traditional family, and to protect our national sovereignty? That is Republicans. Whoops, I skipped ahead. The key to that is the protect innocent life and traditional family. So the next one. Which party supports a change in the law to make it a civil and not a criminal offense for legal adults only to possess 1 ounce or less of marijuana for personal use, punishable by a fine of up to $100 but without jail time? You would think that that would be a more liberal point of view, but it's actually the Republican Party, and it is a kind of a compromise in the current law, which is stricter on marijuana possession versus, and you can see the next box, the Democratic Party supports legislation to legalize the possession and use of cannabis and its derivatives, and to regulate its use, production, and sale, as is successfully done in Colorado, Washington, and other states. So when the Democrats moved to wanting to legalize marijuana, the Republicans shifted from taking a hard stance on making marijuana possession criminal offense, and kind of lightened that stance, or kind of moved their position more towards the middle. Now, which party believes that government should provide multi-language instruction beginning in elementary school to make all students fluent in English and at least one other language? That is the Democrats. What party supports strengthening our common American identity and assimilation of ethnic groups, and encourage non-English speaking students to transition to English within 1 year? That is the Republicans. Okay, we'll do a few more. Which party proudly and vigorously supports a woman's right to choose how to use her body and opposes any and all attempts to overturn Roe v. Wade? A woman's right to choose are the key words, and that is the Democratic Party. Which party opposes abortion because all innocent human life must be respected and safeguarded from fertilization to natural death, and is resolute in their support of the reversal of Roe v. Wade? Republican Party. Which party believes that properly applied capital punishment is legitimate, is an effective deterrent, and should be reasonably swift and unencumbered? Pro-capital punishment is the Republican Party. Which party would abolish the death penalty in Texas and replace it with the punishment of life imprisonment without parole? Anti-death penalty, Democrats. Which party believes the state should establish a 100% equitable school finance system with sufficient state revenue to allow every district to offer an exemplary program? Think about this. This is a redistribution of wealth kind of thinking. So that is a Democratic platform. Which party supports the right to choose public, private, charter, or home education, supports the teaching of biology of reproduction and abstinence until marriage, and school subjects with the emphasis on Judeo-Christian principles upon which America was founded? The Republican Party. Okay, last one. Which party supports comprehensive immigration reform, including an attainable path to citizenship, and the 14th Amendment, which makes all persons born in this country citizens? That is the Democratic Party. Who believes the minimum wage law should be repealed? The Republicans. Who opposes any form of amnesty, including the granting of legal status to persons in the country illegally, and citizenship should be granted at birth only to children born to citizens? That is the Republican Party. And then who supports a minimum wage that is at least $15 an hour that is indexed to keep it from eroding? That is the Democrats. So I hope that kind of helped you see on some different issues where the different parties fall. Now again, this does not mean that every single person who casts their vote for a Republican candidate believes every single thing in the party platform, but these are just some basic beliefs that the party has adopted. Now, when you look at the map of Texas, remember red is Republican, you may think that everyone in Texas is a Republican, but that's not true. You can see that there are some counties that voted for Hillary Clinton in the last presidential election. You can see down on the border of Mexico, down in West Texas, El Paso, and then you'll see there's a little blue dot where Dallas is, a little blue dot where Austin is, a little blue dot where San Antonio is, and then the one on the coast is Houston. The general idea is that the Republican Party is favored by Anglo churchgoers, business people, higher income families, and active and retired military officers. Now, does that mean that every white person who goes to church and has a business and has a lot of money votes for Republican? Absolutely not. It just means that when you are looking to generalize, that is a generalization that is fairly accurate. Now, there are some factions that have been having growing influence in the Republican Party. The first is the evangelical or fundamentalist Christians. They are concerned with family, religion, anti-abortion, limitation of gay rights, and community morals, enforcement of community morals. They will vote as a bloc to elect people who align with their values. The Tea Party, sometimes they're called Tea Party Republicans, opposes taxation and the social services it finances, and favors less government power over individual finances. Now, this faction was formed in response to the federal bailout of banks in 2008 and the implementation of Obamacare. And then finally, there are establishment Republicans who are business leaders who want the party to take more moderate views in order to get Republican candidates elected. They're okay with the government spending money on some things like infrastructure or education because those things help business, but otherwise they want less government involvement with their businesses and with the market. So what will it take for Democrats to win again in Texas? That is a good question that I absolutely do not have the answer for, and frankly, nobody does. The Democrats will need to capture the minority vote. They've been able to court the African American vote, but not as successful with Latino voters. You would think that the National Republican Party's rhetoric about Latino voters and immigration would have caused these voters to vote Democrat, but we see that over a third of Latino voters supported Trump in the 2016 election. Nearly half supported Republican Governor Greg Abbott in 2018. Many Latino voters have traditional values that align more with the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. They also traditionally have lower voter turnout, so the Democrats need to win their votes and then also get them to the polls. The Democrats also need to court swing voters who don't associate with one party or the other. So how are parties organized? Well, there are two parts. There's a temporary part that changes every election cycle and a permanent part that lasts over a number of years. A temporary party member will be the voters who attend the primary election and elect local delegates at precinct conventions. You can do this as a Republican in 2016 and a Democrat in 2020. You don't have to, you're not bound to a certain party. The same with being a local delegate who goes to a countywide or district convention to select statewide delegates. Finally, there are people that are chosen as state delegates that go to the state convention and elect party officers, vote on the platform, and modify party rules. This group can change from election to election and is not part of the permanent organization of the party that exists after the election is over. If it's a presidential election year, the convention will choose presidential electors who will vote for the party's candidate in the event that that candidate wins a majority of the votes in the state. We'll talk about the Electoral College in a different lecture, but just so you know, these electors for the Electoral College are just temporary party delegates. They're usually people who've been supportive of the candidate all along. For example, should the Democrats win all of the Electoral College votes in Texas, the Democrats will send electors who are aligned with Biden, not ones who were in charge of Bernie's campaign or Warren's campaign. Okay, 2 more slides left. So the permanent party is the infrastructure of the party that keeps going from year to year. The precinct chair, the county chair, the state chair all serve 2-year terms. The precinct chair is the one who organizes the precinct for the party, and then the county chair oversees all the different precinct chairs. The county chair is the one who takes care of a lot of the practical parts of an election, such as determining where the voting locations are going to be, appointing election judges to watch the elections, they rent the voting machines, they certify the nominees, print the ballots, oversee gathering of the ballots from the precincts on election night. Like sometimes you will hear, like we talked about, there's X number of precincts reporting on an election. It's because the county chair is trying to gather all of the ballots from all the different precincts. The state chair certifies the winners and presides over the state meetings and conventions. State chair is the face of the party in the state, and they handle press releases, they raise money, and they work as a liaison to the national party and in cooperation with the national party. So finally, we've seen what parties believe and how they're organized, but what do they actually do? The party electorate gives direction for the voters to determine how they will attach and vote. They give information to the voters to help them to know who to elect. They let people know what the party believes in and what the candidates believe in, who the candidates are, who holds certain beliefs, things like that. The party also provides organization or structure to the election activities and to the party activities. They recruit candidates, they raise money, get voters registered, and try to maximize resources to make the party as successful as possible. And finally, the party and government are the elected officials who are serving. They're the face of the party and are involved in party advocacy and debate. And they make sure that the party platform that they were elected on is pursued on the national or the state level, wherever they serve. So that is the end of political parties. and that is halfway through Unit 1.